In the freezing depths of the North Atlantic, July 4, 1961, the Soviet submarine K-19 was running silent when a pressure gauge began to drop. Inside the reactor compartment, a coolant pipe had ruptured. The core temperature soared. Within minutes, the reactor approached meltdown. If it exploded, the blast would destroy the submarine and irradiate the entire ocean. The crew had no backup cooling system, no emergency procedures, no way to escape. They were trapped in a steel coffin, 400 feet below the surface, with radiation levels already climbing into the lethal range. The captain, Nikolai Zateyev, faced an impossible order: send men into the reactor compartment to weld a new pipe, knowing they would absorb fatal doses within minutes. The men volunteered. They knew they were already dead. K-19 was the Soviet Union's first ballistic missile submarine, a symbol of Cold War ambition. Launched in 1959, it was rushed into service to match American nuclear capabilities. The hull was built at the Severodvinsk shipyard, but the reactor system was flawed from the start. The primary coolant loop, a complex network of pipes and pumps, was welded using substandard techniques. Inspectors reportedly flagged the welds, but the schedule was more important than safety. The submarine was commissioned with known defects. Its mission: patrol the Arctic and, if war came, launch nuclear missiles at the United States. But on its maiden voyage, the crew discovered that the reactor was unstable. Leaks, alarms, and erratic readings were common. They called the boat Hiroshima, a dark joke that would soon become prophecy. During sea trials, K-19 developed a persistent leak in the reactor's primary coolant system. The crew reported fluctuating pressure and temperature readings. The chief engineer, Yuri Pavstiev, noted that the pipe welds were brittle and prone to cracking. He filed a report, but the response from Moscow was dismissive. The submarine was ordered to proceed with its patrol. On June 18, 1961, K-19 left for its first combat patrol in the North Atlantic. The reactor operated at reduced power, but the crew knew it was a ticking bomb. They had no radiation suits, no dosimeters for many crew members, and no emergency cooling system for the reactor. The Soviet Navy's philosophy was simple: the mission comes first. If the reactor failed, the crew would have to improvise. There was no backup plan. On July 4, 1961, the reactor's primary coolant pressure dropped sharply. The emergency alarm sounded. The reactor core, now without sufficient cooling, began to overheat. Captain Zateyev ordered the reactor shut down, but the residual heat was immense. The temperature climbed past 800 degrees Celsius. The core was on the verge of melting down, which would rupture the reactor vessel and release a cloud of radioactive steam. The submarine had no backup cooling system. The only way to prevent a catastrophe was to repair the coolant line inside the reactor compartment, where radiation levels were already lethal. Zateyev knew that any man entering would receive a fatal dose. He asked for volunteers. Every single man stepped forward. He selected 8, including the chief engineer and the executive officer. They had minutes to work. The 8 men entered the reactor compartment. The air was thick with radioactive steam. They wore only their standard uniforms, no protective gear. The pipe they needed to weld was directly above the reactor core, where gamma radiation was intense. They worked in shifts of minutes, each man absorbing a dose that would later be estimated at over 5,000 rem, more than 10 times the lethal threshold. They cut away insulation, welded a new pipe, and rigged a makeshift cooling system using a hose from the submarine's freshwater tank. The repair held. The reactor temperature stabilized. The submarine was saved from a nuclear explosion, but the 8 men had already received fatal doses. Within hours, they began vomiting, their skin blistering, their hair falling out. They were dying in agony. The immediate response was a study in chaos and denial. Captain Zateyev radioed for help, but the Soviet Navy did not have radiation emergency protocols. A surface ship, the S-270, arrived to evacuate the worst affected. The 8 men were carried on stretchers, vomiting blood. Others showed symptoms of acute radiation syndrome: nausea, burns, internal bleeding. The Navy ordered a cover-up. The men were not to be diagnosed as radiation victims. Instead, they were listed as suffering from allergic reactions or fatigue. The submarine was towed back to port and the crew was quarantined. The incident was classified. Soviet doctors, not told the true cause, treated the men for unknown illnesses. Many of the 8 died within weeks. The rest of the crew would suffer cancers and other radiation-related diseases for the rest of their lives. As the K-19 limped back to the Soviet Union, the full horror became clear. The submarine was heavily contaminated. Every surface, every pipe, every piece of equipment was radioactive. The crew was moved to a hospital in Moscow, but the doctors were kept in the dark. Rumors spread among naval personnel. The Americans, who had intercepted radio traffic, suspected a nuclear accident, but said nothing publicly. The Soviet Navy ordered a complete overhaul of K-19's reactor, but the work was done by shipyard workers who were not told the extent of the contamination. Many later developed cancers. The submarine was returned to service, a floating monument to the cover-up. The 8 men who had saved the boat were posthumously awarded the Order of the Red Star, but their families were told they died in a training accident. The truth would not emerge for decades. The human cost of K-19 is immeasurable. Of the 8 men who entered the reactor compartment, 6 died within 3 weeks. The remaining 2 died within 2 years. The entire crew of 139 men was exposed to radiation. According to declassified medical records, many developed leukemia, thyroid cancer, and other radiation-induced illnesses. The Soviet Navy suppressed these records. The families were told nothing. Some crew members were denied medical care. It was not until the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, that the truth began to surface. In 2006, the surviving crew members were awarded the Order of Courage. But for most, it was too late. The submarine itself continued to serve until 1991, its reactor compartment still radioactive. It was eventually scrapped, but the contamination remains in the Arctic seabed. The men of K-19 were heroes, and they were forgotten. The cover-up of K-19 was systematic. The Soviet Navy classified all documents related to the accident. The crew was sworn to secrecy. Those who spoke out were threatened with court-martial. The official story was that the submarine had suffered a non-nuclear fire. The true cause, faulty welds in the coolant system, was never publicly acknowledged. In the 1990s, a former KGB officer leaked documents showing that the Soviet government knew the reactor was defective before the accident. No one was ever held accountable. The shipyard managers were promoted. The naval officers who authorized the patrol were decorated. The disaster was a symptom of a system that prioritized military ambition over human life. It would not be the last. The lessons of K-19 were ignored, and the same systemic failures would later contribute to the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. The legacy of K-19 is a cautionary tale about the cost of secrecy and the value of human life. The disaster led to some improvements in Soviet submarine reactor design, but the cover-up prevented a full investigation. It was not until 1994 that the accident was officially acknowledged by the Russian government. The story of the 8 men who sacrificed themselves to save their shipmates is a testament to heroism in the face of impossible odds. They are remembered as the K-19 Widowmakers, a nickname that speaks to the tragedy of their fate. Today, the K-19 disaster serves as a reminder that nuclear safety cannot be compromised for political or military expediency. Subscribe to Nuclear Disasters for more stories of nuclear tragedy and the lessons we must never forget.